he wanted to build a car, as he said, to kick their ass on the street, too. So this is Carroll Shelby's answer to Ferrari. There were rumors it was painted Ferrari red, that was his sort of to Ferrari.
A padlock hadn't been touched in decades, and when it finally gave way, nobody inside that Texas outbuilding was prepared for what the flashlight beam landed on. Not a barn find. Not a rusted-out shell waiting for scrap value. A shape that shouldn't have been there at all. A notchback silhouette wearing a Shelby badge nobody remembered the factory ever building. For half a century, the automotive world had operated on a simple, comfortable assumption. If a prototype vanished from Ford's records in the 1960s, it had been crushed, and crushed cars don't come back. That assumption was wrong, and proving it wrong took more than luck. It took a Texas oil man's stubbornness, a restoration specialist's refusal to accept a dead end, and a piece of paperwork nobody had thought to check. To understand why this discovery mattered, you have to understand the man behind it. Carroll Shelby wasn't an engineer by training, and he wasn't a boardroom executive either. He was a Texas chicken farmer turned endurance racer, a man who drove the 1959 24 Hours of Le Mans to victory alongside Roy Salvadori while wearing his now famous bib overalls, partly for luck and partly because a heart condition already had him living on borrowed time. That same heart condition ended his driving career not long after, and most men would have accepted a quiet retirement. Shelby didn't. He took the lightweight British AC Ace, dropped a Ford V8 into it, and created the Cobra, a car so aggressive it made the polished European sports cars it was built to humiliate look overdressed. That was Shelby's gift. He didn't invent new parts so much as he combined existing ones with a kind of reckless clarity nobody else in Detroit or Turin seemed willing to try. By the mid-1960s, Ford had a problem money alone couldn't fix. Ferrari owned endurance racing, and Henry Ford II wanted that dominance broken, publicly and repeatedly. The GT40 program needed someone who understood racing not as an engineering exercise but as a fight, and Shelby American took the wheel of that effort. The payoff was one of the most famous stretches in motorsport history, Ford beating Ferrari at Le Mans in 1966, then defending that win in 1967, 1968, and 1969. Around that same period, Ford also handed Shelby something very different, the Mustang, a car built for volume sales, not violence. Lee Iacocca understood how to sell the Mustang to secretaries and school teachers. Shelby understood how to make it bite. The GT350 arrived in 1965, the GT500 followed in 1967, and both cars turned a friendly pony car into something with genuine teeth. But the cars everyone remembers, the Cobras, the GT350S, the GT40S, were never the whole story. Behind every production Shelby sat a much messier world of test mules, engineering dead ends, and prototypes that were never meant to survive past the moment they finished their job. In the 1960s, nobody at Ford or Shelby American was thinking about future auction values. A prototype existed to answer a question, and once the question was answered, the car itself was disposable, sold off quietly, stripped for parts, or sent straight to the crusher. That disposability is exactly why the disappearance of one particular car, known only by its nickname, became one of the most frustrating unsolved mysteries in Shelby history. That car was Little Red, a 1967 Shelby GT500 EXP prototype, and even its shape marked it as an outsider. It wasn't a fastback like the Shelbys most people picture. It was a notchback coupe, one of only two experimental Shelby notchbacks ever built, the other being the 1968 Green Hornet. Little Red wasn't built to be sold. It was a rolling laboratory, used to test big block power, early supercharging setups, and styling ideas that Ford and Shelby American weren't yet ready to commit to production. Its influence didn't stay locked inside a garage either. Elements of its styling helped shape the 1968 Mustang California Special, meaning that long before anyone found the actual car again, the public had already been looking at pieces of its design without knowing where they came from. For decades, the accepted explanation for Little Red's disappearance was the obvious one. It had been destroyed, just like so many other prototypes that had served their purpose and outlived their usefulness to a corporation with no sentimental attachment to test mules. Collectors had photographs. Historians had old documentation and second-hand memories. What nobody had was the car itself, and eventually the absence hardened into accepted fact. That fact might have stood forever if not for the restoration of Green Hornet. Craig Jackson, chairman and CEO of Barrett-Jackson, owned that surviving prototype, a car fitted with genuinely advanced ideas for its era, including electronic fuel injection, four-wheel disc brakes, and independent rear suspension, features that made it feel like it had wandered in from a decade later than the one it was built in. While restoring Green Hornet, Jackson and restoration specialist Jason Billups began asking an obvious but previously unasked question. If this one survived against every expectation, could Little Red have survived too? The breakthrough that followed wasn't cinematic. Nobody pulled a dust sheet off a hidden supercar under a single dramatic light. It came from paperwork, and from realizing that everyone had been chasing the wrong identity. For years, searchers had used the Shelby serial number, and that trail went nowhere every single time. Billups and his team eventually understood that Little Red had two identities layered on top of each other. The Shelby designation everyone knew, and underneath it, the original Ford VIN that had never been the focus of the search. Once they started tracing that Ford VIN instead, old registration records and ownership history began falling into place, and the trail led, improbably, into rural North Texas. On March 3, 2018, the search ended in a field, not a museum. The car was rough. The engine and transmission were missing. Body panels were gone. It sat among a scatter of other aging vehicles, exactly the kind of scene most people would walk past without a second glance. To anyone who didn't know the VIN and the history behind it, it looked like just another tired old Mustang shell rotting in the Texas heat. To the people who did know, it was the automotive equivalent of a lost manuscript turning up in someone's attic. Little Red's survival wasn't the result of careful preservation. It survived through neglect, through passing between owners who likely never grasped what they actually had, through being stripped, moved, and forgotten rather than protected. That's precisely what makes prototypes so vulnerable in the first place. A production classic gets recognized and protected by collectors almost by instinct, but a prototype with no clear paper trail can be parted out, ignored, or scrapped by someone who simply doesn't know better. Little Red slipped through that gap for over 50 years, saved not by design but by the accident of nobody ever making the decision to finish it off. Once Craig Jackson, Jason Billups, and Mustang authentication expert Kevin Marty confirmed what the car actually was, the story shifted permanently from folklore into documented history. That authentication raised the next hard question: what do you actually do with a car like this once you found it? Some purists argued it should be left exactly as discovered: dust, rust, missing parts and all, treating every flaw as physical proof of the decades it had survived. Restore it too completely, they warned, and you risk erasing the very evidence that makes the discovery meaningful. Others pointed out that Shelby never built cars to sit motionless under gallery lighting. He built them to run, to be loud, to be driven hard. Jackson's team ultimately chose the harder path, bringing Little Red back to life while documenting every step of that process, aware that restoring a one-of-one prototype isn't like restoring a production car with a clear factory blueprint to follow. There was no single definitive spec to return to, because the car itself had been a moving experiment throughout its working life. In January 2020, Little Red was unveiled publicly at Barrett-Jackson in Scottsdale, Arizona, standing beside the restored Green Hornet for the first time in history, two experimental Shelby notchbacks that had shaped decades of collector mythology, finally sharing the same room. The moment mattered beyond the price tag it eventually commanded. It proved that even in a corner of automotive history as heavily documented as Shelby's Ford years, there were still gaps big enough to swallow an entire car for 50-plus years. It proved that accepted history isn't always finished history, and that sometimes the difference between a legend and a lie is simply someone willing to check a different set of records. Little Red wasn't found because someone got lucky wandering through a field. It was recovered because a small group of people refused to accept an old, comfortable answer, and instead went looking for the identity hiding underneath the one everyone already knew. What Little Red really represents isn't just rarity, though it is genuinely rare, the only GT500 coupe Shelby American ever built. It represents the space where Carroll Shelby actually did his most important work, not in the showroom, not in the press releases, but in the tension between what a corporation was willing to sell and what a builder was willing to try first. Somewhere out there, in another field, another storage unit, another quiet property nobody's thought to search properly, there may be one more car like it, misidentified, overlooked, waiting on the right person to ask the right question about the right number. Little Red spent 50 years being wrong about its own identity in the eyes of everyone who mattered, until it wasn't. That's the part of this story worth sitting with. History isn't always lost. Sometimes it's just misfiled, patiently waiting in the Texas dust for someone stubborn enough to read the paperwork twice.